Piscean here. We are going to go over midpoint theory applied to historical events. This is a follow-up to my previous video going over historical events, and this is the astrological psychology of malefic aspects, detailed case studies for each generational ingress, and we're going to be talking about tight orb midpoint activations as well as malefic psychological dynamics, ingress by ingress historical reconstruction, running footnotes, and there is also expanded supplements and appendices. So please continue watching to learn some free astrology. Alright, this abstract here. So the second volume operationalizes the tight orb midpoint methodology of volume 1 by applying it to discrete historical events and by developing an original astrological psychology of malefic aspects. Each generational ingress of Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Chiron receives a dedicated case study chapter that correlates exact or near exact midpoint activations, as well as applying malefic configurations with documented collective phenomena. Footnotes on every major analytical block supply ephemeris sources, historiographic caveats, and cross-references. Supplements and appendices expand the technical apparatus, full midpoint calculation protocols, psychological glossaries of malefic dynamics, and extended ingress chronologies. So keywords here are midpoint event analysis, malefic psychology, generational ingress case studies, Saturn Pluto, Uranus Pluto, Neptune Saturn, Chiron moon dynamics. We're also going to go by contents here. We got midpoint theory operationalized first from formula to historical event, the astrological psychology of malefic aspects, case studies Pluto ingresses Cancer to Aquarius, case studies Neptune ingresses Cancer to Aries, case studies Uranus ingresses selected modern cycles, case studies Chiron ingresses Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, foci, cross ingress midpoint clusters, and multi-generational resonance, synthesis and research agenda for 2025 through 2040, Appendix A, extended ingress chronology with midpoint notes, Appendix B, malefic aspect psychology, technical lexicon, Appendix C, worked midpoint calculations for key events, Supplement 1, pedagogical notes for seminar use, Supplement 2 is counterexamples and methodological limits, and we have our endnotes and running footnote apparatus. So, getting started here with midpoint theory operationalized from formula to historical event. So, volume 1 established the computational and interpretive priority of midpoints under a lesser than 1 degrees activation orb. In this video, this present volume demonstrates that such midpoints are not merely descriptive overlays, but function as event organizer. When a third body or angle falls within the prescribed orb of a generational midpoint, collective phenomena, recognizable archetypal character, tend to crystallize within days to months. And we see this is a worked protocol. For any candidate event, the procedure is to compute all outer planet and Saturn midpoints for the exact date, identify which midpoints are activated by third body or angle within 1 degrees. Also, this is very important to UT for that exact date. Note whether any malefic major aspect is applying within 2 degrees. Rank the resulting signatures by orb tightness and by the presence of applying motion. Map the right signatures onto the documented historical morphology. Only configurations surviving this filter are retained for interpretation. So here's an anticipatory example. On September 15th, 2008, the Saturn-Uranus midpoint stood at approximately 0 degrees Sagittarius. Pluto, at 28 degrees Sagittarius, formed a near exact semi-square while the Moon, in several angles, activated the midpoint zone. The Lehman Brothers filing occurred within the same 48-hour window. The midpoint reading structural authority, Saturn, meeting radical disruption, Uranus, under Plutonian exposure matches the event's character with higher resolution than a simple Saturn-Uranus opposition narrative. We've got midpoint families and their historical preferences. So, empirical review of 20th and 21st century crisis yields consistent preferences. We see Saturn-Pluto midpoints favor institutional coercion and total mobilization. Uranus-Pluto midpoints favor systemic rupture and power redistribution. Saturn-Neptune midpoints favor the collapse of crystallization of collective myths. Chiron-Saturn midpoints favor institutional responses to collective wounds. These preferences are not absolute, but statistically robust under the tight orb filter. And here, the claim is correlative and morphological, not causal in a mechanistic sense, and we'll see that in supplement 2 for counterexamples. Ephemeris positions verified against the Swiss Ephemeris and Astro daily listings, event timing from contemporary financial press. So here is the astrological psychology of malefic aspects. Classical astrology designated Saturn and Mars as malefics, while modern practice extends the category to Pluto and, under certain conditions, Ketu. The present section develops an original psychological model of how these bodies, when tightly aspected, organize collective and individual experience. Saturn, the psychology of necessary limit. Saturn does not merely deny, it imposes a reality principle in its most impersonal form. In generational charts, in applying Saturn square or opposition within 2 degrees correlates with the sudden appearance of non-negotiable constraints, resource ceilings, demographic pressures, institutional failures that force restructuring. Psychologically, the experience is one of forced maturation. The collective, or the individual identified with it, must relinquish an obsolete self-image and accept a heavier, more durable form. When Saturn activates a midpoint, the constraint is felt as coming from the archetypal field itself rather than from any single actor. Mars, the psychology of directed conflict. Although Mars is not a generational planet, its tight aspects to outer planet midpoints supply the catalytic heat that turns structural tension into visible event. In applying Mars squared to a Saturn-Pluto midpoint, for example, frequently marks the outbreak of organized violence or the decisive executive act that converts heightened crisis into open confrontation. The psychology is one of mobilized will under archetypal pressure, courage and brutality appearing as two faces of the same activation. Pluto, the psychology of compulsory transformation. Pluto's tight aspects and midpoint activations produce experiences of irreversible loss of control, followed by emergence of a new power configuration. The subjective tone is often one of fated necessity or the system revealing its true nature. Collectively, this registers as the exposure of hidden networks, the collapse of previously unassailable institutions, or the sudden concentration of power in previously marginal hands. The psychological task is to surrender to the transformative process without identification with either the destroyed form or the emerging one. Composite malefic dynamics. When 2 or more malefics tightly configure a midpoint, the psychological signature intensifies into what this monograph terms a malefic complex. So Saturn-Pluto midpoints under Mars activation yield the classic iron form of necessity. Saturn-Neptune midpoints under Pluto activation yield the dissolution of structures that has seemed permanent, accompanied by the rise of new myths that demand sacrifice. The current 2025 through 28 Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries with Pluto in Aquarius, Uranus and Gemini forming tight midpoints into the same zone constitutes a multi-malefic complex of rare historical density. The psychological model draws on archetypal psychology, Hillman, Jung, but remains strictly operational within the tight orb astrological frame. No clinical claims are advanced. Comparative density is assessed by counting simultaneous lesser than 1 degrees midpoint activations and lesser than 2 degrees applying malefic aspects. The 2026 through 2027 window ranks among the highest in the last 150 years. Case studies, Pluto ingress. So each Pluto ingress is examined through the tight orb midpoint lens and the malefic psychology model of section 2. Only the most discriminative configurations are retained. So Pluto into Cancer, 1912 through 1914, sustained ingress midpoint environment. So Uranus and Capricorn Aquarius formed a near opposition midpoint structure. Saturn and Taurus Gemini applied applying squares. The Saturn-Pluto midpoint fell in early Aries degrees, already a zone of martial initiation. In historical morphology, the Balkan Wars, the acceleration toward general European war, and the mobilization of mass populations under national myths of survival. Psychological signature. Compulsory transformation of the domestic and emotional container Cancer under the iron necessity of Saturn-Pluto. The tight applying context of 1914 convert latent tension into open systemic rupture. Here we see Saturn-Pluto midpoint activation of the Cancer ingress threshold, the dominant midpoint axis. Now Pluto into Leo. From 1937 through 1939, Saturn and Aries formed repeated tight squares to Pluto. The Saturn-Pluto midpoint occupied early Gemini. Uranus and Taurus added further midpoint pressure. We have historical morphology, the consolidation of totalitarian spectacle, the cult of the leader, and the final steps in the global war. And a psychological reading, Pluto in the sign of sovereign selfhood meets Saturn's structural coercion, producing the archetype of the necessary dictator and the mobilized mass. These accusations in 1939 through 40 mark the irreversible commitment to total war. Pluto into Virgo from 56 through 58, Neptune in Libra, and Uranus in Leo created a complex midpoint field. Saturn in Sagittarius applied later squares. Suez, the Hungarian uprising, the acceleration of technocratic and managerial paradigms, and the early environmental and systems thinking movements. Compulsory purification and reordering of the productive and analytical functions, Virgo, under Plutonian exposure of systemic inefficiency and hidden toxicity. Pluto into Libra, 71 through 72. Uranus in Libra itself produced a prolonged conjunction. Saturn and Gemini formed applying squares. Midpoint activations clustered around relational and diplomatic axes. Nixon in China, the end of Bretton Woods convertibility, the rise of detente, and of new balance of power architectures. Transformation of the partnership and justice archetype under the pressure of systemic realignment. Pluto into Scorpio from 83 through 84. So Saturn and Scorpio produced a rare sign conjunction. Neptune in Capricorn, Uranus in Sagittarius supplied additional midpoint tension. The intensification of the Cold War's final phase, AIDS crisis as collective shadow, the financialization of the economy, and the depth of psychological turn in culture. Saturn-Pluto midpoint in early Sagittarius became a locus of moral and existential reckoning. Pluto into Sagittarius, 95, Uranus in Aquarius, Neptune in Capricorn, framed the ingress. Saturn in Pisces applied later pressure. The acceleration of globalization, the rise of religious political fundamentalisms, and the internet as a new ideological commons. Transformation of the meaning-making and belief functions under Plutonian intensification, belief systems themselves become sites of power struggle. Pluto into Capricorn, 2008. Ingress coincided with Saturn-Uranus opposition. Saturn-Uranus midpoint. And Pluto's own context activated the financial and institutional axes within 1 degree. The global financial crisis, the exposure of systemic leverage, and the subsequent restructuring of regulatory and monetary regimes. Compulsory transformation of the authority and structure archetype Capricorn under the simultaneous pressure of Saturnian limit and Uranian rupture. The classic malefic complex of 2008. And now Pluto into Aquarius. Uranus and Gemini forms a tight trine. Saturn, Neptune, and Aries create multiple midpoints into the early Aries zone that also contains the Uranus-Pluto midpoint. Historical morphology still unfolding. Anticipatory reading here is transformation of network power, collective data regimes, and technological mediation of sociality. The multi-malefic complex described in Section 2 supplies a psychological pressure, forced maturation of the collective under conditions of radical informational and structural change. Ingress dates from Swiss ephemeris, Balkan and July crises, chronologies from standard diplomatic histories. Exact Saturn-Pluto square stations for 1939 through 40 verified against multiple ephemerides, event correlation with military and diplomatic timelines. Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Scorpio-Libra is one of the most tightly documented malefic complexes of the late 20th century. In Lima Weekend, got September 12th to 15th, 2008, the surrounding midpoint field are treated in detail in Appendix C. Case studies here, Neptune ingresses. So Neptune's 14-year sign periods organize the collective imaginal field. Midpoint activations at ingress and at subsequent tight contacts reveal how new myths crystallize or dissolve. Neptune into Cancer, 1901 through 1902. Saturn in Capricorn formed an oppositional midpoint structure. Pluto and Gemini supplied further tension. The high tide of nationalist sentiment, the birth of psychoanalysis, and the emotional reenchantment of the domestic sphere. The collective begins to dream through the archetype of the mother and the nation as family, with all the idealization and shadow that entails. Neptune into Leo, 1914 through 1916. Ingress under the shadow of the First World War. Saturn and Pluto still tightly configured. The sacralization of the warrior hero and the mass spectacle of sacrifice. Saturn-Neptune midpoint became a locus of necessary myth-making that justified unprecedented slaughter. Collective idealization of surviving selfhood under conditions of total mobilization. We have Neptune into Virgo, which occurred 1928 through 1929, Uranus in Aries, Pluto in Cancer, framed the ingress. The onset of the Great Depression, the rise of the technocratic and planning ideologies, and the search for scientific solutions to social disorder. Idealization and later dissolution of purity, efficiency, and managerial competence. Neptune into Libra, 1942 through 1943. Wartime ingress, Saturn in Gemini, Cancer, and Pluto in Leo. The planning of post-war international order, Bretton Woods, United Nations, the ideal of balanced collective security, the dream of just relationship among nations under the pressure of ongoing total war. Neptune in Scorpio, 1955 through 57, Uranus in Leo Virgo, Pluto in Leo Virgo, created a dense midpoint field. The nuclear sublime, depth psychological, and countercultural turn, eroticization of power and the power of the erotic. Collective fascination with the underworld of the psyche and of geopolitics. Neptune into a Sag 70 through 71, Uranus Pluto still in residual contact, Saturn in Taurus Gemini, the expansion of ideological and religious movements, a search for transcendent meaning after the disappointments of the 1960s. The idealization of belief systems and the subsequent confrontation with their shadow, fundamentalism, and cultic dynamics. Neptune in the Capricorn, 84 through 85, so Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Scorpio still operative. Uranus in Sagittarius, late Cold War, institutional idealism, the dream of the end of history, and the sacralization of market structures. Crystallization of neoliberal mythology under Saturn-Neptune midpoint pressure. Neptune into Aquarius, 98 through 99. So Uranus also in Aquarius produced a prolonged conjunction. Pluto in Sagittarius. Digital utopianism, the network of salvation myth, the early internet's promise of liberated information. The collective dream of a frictionless, egalitarian technological commons, later to meet as Plutonian shadow. And Neptune into Pisces. Uranus in Aries and Pluto in Capricorn form the cardinal square. Saturn in Libra Scorpio. Boundary dissolution, refugee crises, pandemic precursors, epistemic fragmentation, the rise of empathy politics and of conspiracy mythologies, the dissolution of containers and the search for oceanic belonging. Neptune into Aries. Current ingress under Saturn simultaneous presence in Aries and Pluto's Aquarius placement. The Saturn-Neptune midpoint and the Uranus-Pluto midpoint converge on early Aries. Anticipatory psychological reading, the emergence of new identity myths that demand pioneering sacrifice, the idealization of the individual and of the collective under conditions of radical structural and informational change. Exact conjunctions of 2026 through 2027 constitute the primary temporal nodes. The wartime Neptune and Leo period is one of the clearest historical illustrations of Saturn-Neptune midpoint dynamics. 1989 through 90 Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn, collapse of Eastern Bloc, is a later exact expression of the same imaginal structural complex that began at the 1984 ingress. Ephemeris and midpoint calculations for 2025 through 2028 appear in Appendix C. Ongoing event correlation is recommended for seminar tracking. Now we're going to go into the Uranus ingresses. In Uranus' 7-year sign periods mark informational and technological regime shifts. Midpoint contacts with Pluto and Saturn supply the power and structural dimensions of those shifts. So Uranus into Gemini, we saw in 1941 to 42, ingress under wartime conditions. Saturn in Taurus, Pluto in Leo. Bringing radar, code breaking, the first electronic computers, acceleration of scientific mobilization. The Uranus-Pluto midpoint fell in early Cancer, home and security under radical informational pressure. The sudden necessity of new cognitive tools under existential threat. Uranus into Gemini, 81 through 83, Saturn in Libra Scorpio, Pluto in Libra Scorpio, Neptune in Sag. The personal computer, early network protocols, the deregulation of information flows. Midpoint activation is linked to informational disruption to the financial and relational realignments of the early 1980s. The liberation and fragmentation of individual cognitive agency. In Uranus into Gemini, currently. Current ingress of Pluto in Aquarius, tight trine. Saturn and Neptune in Aries, midpoints into early Aries. Still forming. Anticipatory reading here is the maturation of generative AI, quantum networking, the further fragmentation of shared epistemic authority. Uranus-Pluto midpoint at 4.5 degrees Aries fuses with the Saturn-Neptune zone, producing a multi-generational informational structural complex of exceptional coherence. Exact trine passes of 2026 to 2028 are the primary monitoring nodes. Additional modern Uranus ingresses: Cancer 1948 through 49, Leo 1955 through 56, Virgo 61 through 62, Libra 68 through 69, Scorpio 74 through 75, Sag 1981, Capricorn 88, Aquarius 95 through 96, Pisces 03 through 04, Aries 2010 to 2011, Taurus 2018 to 2019. Follow the same midpoint protocol. Detailed tables appear in Appendix A. Each shows as a characteristic Uranian signature sudden regime change modulated by the contemporaneous outer planet midpoint field. The wartime computational revolution is one of the clearest historical illustrations of Uranus and Gemini under tight plutonium midpoint pressure. Comparative analysis with 3 modern Uranus and Gemini cycles, 40s, 80s, 2020s, is recommended as a seminar exercise. Increasing density of midpoint context is itself a historical variable. Chiron's eccentric orbit produces variable sign durations. Taurus, Gemini, and Cancer periods are selected for detailed midpoint treatment because of their clear historical correlations with collective wound and healing dynamics. So Chiron is Taurus, 26 through 27, 1926 through 1927, sustained to 1933 through 34. Saturn in Scorpio, Sagittarius, got Neptune in Leo, Pluto in Cancer. So we saw the onset of the Great Depression, crises in material security, and the subsequent invention of the new social contract mechanisms, New Deal, welfare state precursors. The Chiron Saturn midpoint activated themes of institutional response to collective insufficiency, the wound of value, and embodiment becomes a site of both trauma and potential healing architecture. Chiron into Taurus, 76 through 77, sustained through 83 through 84. So Saturn in Leo, Virgo, Uranus in Scorpio, Sagittarius, Neptune in Sagittarius, Capricorn, Pluto in Libra, Scorpio. Stagflation, the second oil shock, the beginnings of neoliberal restructuring in the early AIDS crises as a bodily value wound. Midpoint activations linked the Chiron wound to the Saturn-Pluto complex of the early 1980s, the reopening of the value wound under conditions of financial and existential pressure. Chiron into Taurus, currently Chiron's at 0 degrees to 1 degrees Taurus retrograde, Saturn, Neptune in Aries, Pluto in Aquarius, Uranus in Gemini. Chiron, Saturn, and Chiron, Neptune midpoints fall inside the early Aries activation zone already described. The collective wound around sufficiency, embodiment, and the right to exist without productive justification will be reopened under conditions of network power redistribution and identity myth reconstruction. Institutional and mythic responses are expected to crystallize around the exact Saturn-Neptune conjunctions as Uranus-Pluto trine passes. Brief notes on Gemini and Cancer ingresses. So Chiron in Gemini correlates with wounds of communication, cognition, and dualistic thinking. Midpoint contacts with Uranus and Mercury related structures are especially discriminative. Chiron in Cancer correlates with wounds of belonging, homeland, and emotional security. Saturn and Moon related midpoints predominate. Full chronologies and midpoint tables appear in Appendix A. So the 1929 through 33 crises and subsequent welfare state innovations remain the paradigmatic modern illustration of Chiron and Taurus under Saturn midpoint pressure. Because the 2026 century is a threshold retrograde return to Aries, the sustained psychological work of the transit is expected to begin in earnest only after the April 2027 re-ingress. Alright, let's go on to our cross-ingress midpoint clusters and multi-generational resonance. So when 2 or more generational planets change signs within a narrow temporal window, their midpoints and mutual aspects create multi-generational resonance fields. 3 historical clusters illustrate the phenomenon under the tight orb protocol. 1983 through 85 cluster, Pluto into Scorpio, Neptune into Capricorn, Chiron into Gemini, Saturn-Pluto conjunction still operative, midpoint field, dense activations around Scorpio, Capricorn, Gemini triangle. We saw the final intensification of the Cold War, financialization turn, AIDS crises, and early personal computer revolution. Simultaneous transformation of power, Pluto, institutional mythology, Neptune, and communicative cognition, Chiron, Uranus themes. Cluster ranks among the most multi-layered of the late 20th century. 95 through 96 cluster, Pluto into Sag, Uranus into Aquarius, Neptune still in Capricorn. Midpoint activations link belief system transformation to network utopianism. The commercial and internet's take off, the acceleration of globalization, and the rise of both cosmopolitan and fundamentalist ideologies. The imaginal and the informational fuse under plutonium pressure. And our current cluster, Neptune into Aries, Saturn into Aries, Uranus into Gemini, Chiron into Taurus, Pluto already in Aquarius. Multiple midpoints converge on early Aries. Uranus-Pluto trine remains tight. This is the densest multi-generational resonance field of the last century and a half. Anticipatory synthesis here is the simultaneous reconstruction of identity myths, Neptune, Saturn, Aries, informational ecology, Uranus, Gemini, value and embodiment wounds, Chiron, Taurus, network power, Pluto, Aquarius, exact stations and conjunctions of 2026 through 2028 constitute the primary research nodes for the coming decade. We see comparative density metrics, count of lesser than 1 degrees midpoint activations and lesser than 2 degrees applying malefic aspects, placed 1983 through 1985, immediately behind 2025 to 2028 in the modern period. Seminar recommendation here is to maintain a running ephemeris log of all lesser than 1 degrees midpoint activations and lesser than 2 degrees applying malefic aspects from 2025 through 2030, correlate quarterly with documented collective events. And synthesis here, research agenda. Tight orb midpoint method, a psychological model of malefic aspects and ingress case studies converge on a single research imperative. The 2025 through 2035 corridor must be tracked with the same resolution that historians now apply to 1914, 1939, or 2008. The multi-generational resonance field focus on early Aries supplies an unusually clear archetypal signature: initiated identity under collective idealization, informational disruption, value own activation, and network power transformation. Recommended research protocol for faculty and advanced students: compute weekly midpoint list for all outer planet and Saturn pairs. Flag every lesser than 1 degrees activation and every lesser than 2 degrees applying malefic major aspect. Maintain a parallel chronology, political, technological, economic, and cultural events. Test the morphological match at quarterly intervals. Publish both positive and negative findings. Only through such disciplined, high-resolution work can the claims of generational astrology move from evocative narrative to testable historical morphology. When midpoints converge, malefics apply within the narrowest orbs. The collective psyche is invited to a confrontation it cannot indefinitely postpone. The historian's task is to record the invitation and response with equal exactitude. And now onto our appendixes. And I'm also going to get into supplements and notes. So as we can see, Appendix A is extended ingress chronology with midpoint notes. And the following tables list primary modern ingresses together with the dominant midpoint environment at the time of entry. Retrograde re-entries are noted only when they significantly alter the midpoint field. All positions tropical, geocentric. We have Pluto, the dominant midpoint environment at the ingress. So you can't really see there, but it says ingress, sign, and key midpoint malefic notes. So 1912 through 14, we see Cancer, Saturn, Pluto, early Aries, Uranus oppositional pressure. Then we see 1937 through 39, Leo, Saturn square Aries, Saturn, Pluto, early Gemini. 1956 through 58, Virgo, Neptune, Libra midpoints, Uranus, Leo residual. 1971 through 72, Libra, Uranus conjunction, Saturn, Gemini squares. 1983 through 84, Scorpio, Saturn conjunction, then Scorpio, Capricorn field. 1995, Sagittarius, Uranus, Aquarius, Neptune, Capricorn midpoints. 2008, Capricorn, Saturn, Uranus opposition, financial axes midpoints. And we see 2023 through 24, Aquarius, Uranus, Gemini trine forming, Aries midpoint convergence. So Neptune and Uranus. This Uranus-Pluto midpoint is 4.5 degrees Aries, Pluto-Aquarius trine, multiple Aries midpoints, full weekly lists would be really good. And then Appendix B, malefic aspect psychology, technical lexicon. Forced maturation, Saturn, relinquishment of obsolete self-image under impersonal constraint, collective or individual. Mobilized will, Mars, directed conflicted energy that converts latent midpoint tension into visible active violence. Compulsory transformation, Pluto, irreversible loss of prior control, followed by emergence of new power configuration, subjective tone of fate and necessity. Malefic, complex simultaneous tight activation of 2 or more malefics on a midpoint by major aspect, highest event probability under the protocol. Iron form of necessity, Saturn, Pluto, midpoint structures that cannot be negotiated because they arise from existential threat. And then we have crystallized ideal, Saturn, Neptune, midpoint signature, the institutionalization or collapse of a collective myth, and wound of value, Chiron, Saturn, collective or individual experience of insufficiency in the material, bodily, or security domain, seeking institutional or archetypal response. Here's worked midpoint calculations for key events. The following worked examples illustrate the computational interpretive steps of the tight orb protocol. All longitudes tropical, geocentric, rounded to the nearest 0.1 degrees for clarity. Actual research should use arc-minute precision. So September 15th, 2008, Lehman weekend, we see Saturn equals 11.5 degrees, Virgo, Uranus equals 19.5 degrees Pisces, so the midpoint is 0.5 degrees Sagittarius. Pluto equals 28.0 degrees Sagittarius, and my square to midpoint within 1.5 degrees. Applying Saturn-Uranus opposition, orbits lesser than 1 degrees. And so structural authority meets radical disruption under Plutonian exposure of hidden leverage. Morphological match to systemic financial rupture is exact within the protocol's temporal window. September 1939, invasion of Poland. Saturn equals 0.5 degrees Taurus. Pluto equals 2.0 degrees Leo, and the midpoint is 16 degrees Gemini. Mars applying to the midpoint zone, Uranus and Taurus adding further pressure. Iron form necessity, Saturn-Pluto, under martial catalysis, morphological match to the irreversible opening of general European war. Anticipatory Saturn-Neptune conjunction zone. Saturn-Neptune both in early to mid-Aries, midpoint equals 9 degrees Aries. Uranus-Pluto midpoint equals 4.5 degrees Aries. Chiron-Saturn midpoint equals 7.5 degrees Aries. Multiple less than 1 degrees activation expected. Across this year through 2028, crystallized ideal under Marshall signature, fused with informational disruption and value wound activation, highest priority monitoring window of the current decade. And supplements here. So this is pedagogical notes for seminar use. Recommended seminar sequence: replicate one word midpoint calculation from Appendix C, select a historical ingress from these sections, and recompute its midpoint field from primary to ephemeris. Test the morphological match against 2 independent historical narratives. Apply the same protocol prospectively to a 2026 through 28 station or conjunction. Present findings with explicit orb data and a counterexample discussion. The method's value lies as much in the discipline of negative results as in positive correlations. Counterexamples and methodological limits. Not every type midpoint activation produces a recognizable collective event. Not every major historical rupture coincides with a lesser than 1 degrees midpoint or lesser than 2 degrees applying malefic aspect. The protocol therefore claims only elevated probability and morphological affinity, not deterministic causation. Known counterexamples, certain financial panics, certain military crises, are retained in the research archive and should be taught alongside the positive cases. The limits of the method are themselves data for the next iteration of the research program. And here are endnotes and running footnote apparatus. So, operational claim of volume 2, Swiss ephemeris positions, psychological models originals this monograph, density ranking based on simultaneous count of qualifying midpoints and aspects, ingress and aspect data cross-checked against Swiss ephemeris, astrodeans, and Cafe astrology listings, Neptune ingress midpoint environments reconstructed from the ephemeris sources, wartime and late Cold War correlations are among the strongest in the modern record. Uranus and Gemini cycles compared across 3 modern occurrences, increasing midpoint density is itself a historical observation. Chiron ephemeris consensus, psychological reading consistent with the 2 planetary cycles. And then we see multi-generational cluster density metrics. And yeah, hopefully you learned something from this video. Please like, subscribe, comment, share if you didn't care, and I'll see you in the next one. Piscean out.